My role is one defined as looking at the Portuguese diaspora, that is, looking at early modern Jewish history through the lens of the Portuguese Jews, beginning with the 15th century for several hundred years to the 18th century. The beginning of this period, and this is very important in terms of understanding who and what was the importance of Portuguese Jewry. At the beginning of this period, meaning the 15th century, and specifically 1496, 1497, Jewish life in Western Europe was outlawed. Except for a few pockets of Jewry that remained in Italy, Jews had been expelled from England in 1290, they had been expelled from France in 1394, they had been expelled from Spain in 1492, and were expelled / converted in Portugal in 1497. At the end of this period of 300 years, a new global map of Jewish settlement had been established. And it was established, much of the credit for which goes to the unique diaspora of Portuguese Jews. So my task is sort of to both trace the diaspora, to tell you some of its distinctive traits, and at the same time to look at it within the framework of Jewish history. So I'll try to do this and hope it works. Let me begin just to convey to you one of the most unusual and actually somewhat annoying and astonishing traits of Portuguese Jews that is very Iberian, with its own reasons that we can't go into. And I'll begin with a quote, with a statement that comes from the time of the French Revolution. In 1762, in response to Voltaire's attacks on the Jews, the great Sephardic thinker and economist of Amsterdam, Isaac de Pinto, issued a very famous statement on the distinctions between Sephardic / Portuguese and Ashkenazic Jews, expressing a deeply held conviction at that time among Sephardim, less deeply held today, but still held, of their separate and superior identity. I quote, "If at that time," quoting de Pinto, "if at that time Monsieur de Voltaire had consulted the common sense in which he took such pride, he would have first distinguished the Portuguese and Spanish Jews from the rest, for they never mingled or joined with the masses of the other sons of Jacob. The distance between them and their brethren is so great that if a Portuguese Jew dwelling in Holland or France were to marry an Ashkenazic Jewish woman, he would immediately lose all privileges. He would no longer be considered a member of their synagogue, and he would be completely removed from the nation, the Nassau, the Portuguese nation. They, the Portuguese Jews, are of the opinion that they're derived from the tribe of Judah, whose honorable families were exiled to the land of Spain, the time of the Babylonian exile. This opinion leads them to separation and develops feelings of superiority within them. Everyone has regard for them, and even their brethren among the nations seem to recognize them." De Pinto's assertions of Sephardic noble lineage, distinct from and superior to the Ashkenazim, were persuasive. Only in June of 1789, the Sephardic Jews of Bordeaux and Bayonne were emancipated. Only 20 months later, after much debate, were the Ashkenazim granted civic emancipation in France. True, de Pinto's claim of superiority was in some ways apologetic. Yet it goes back to a very strong strain in Portuguese history and Portuguese Jewish history that I'd like to address in the course of my remarks. The story of the Portuguese diaspora begins technically and actually, not in Portugal, but in Spain. And it begins not in 1497, but in that fateful year of 1391, when the Jews of Spain, or actually all of Iberia and of Majorca, were engulfed in a wave of pogroms that lasted for 1 year, spreading like wildfire from town to town, goaded on by mendicant friars from the plazas and town squares, aggravated by a year of drought and the political vacuum that was created by a series of absentee rulers. When the dust of 1391 had settled, roughly 1/3 of Spanish Jews had been forcibly converted. 1/3 had been murdered or martyred, and 1/3 had remained Jewish. Many of these survivors who had been in hiding or had fled, or in some cases had been protected locally, but many of them had found shelter in Portugal, including the grandfather of Don Isaac Abravanel. So Abravanel himself, the great hero of 1492, was descended from one of these conversos who had been forcibly converted. The results of 1391 were devastating. The back of the largest and the most cultured Jewish community then living in the world was broken. The scale of the riots and forced conversions was unprecedented, and it inaugurated a half millennium of martyrdom, heroism, and ambiguity among the Sephardic Jews. When calm was restored at the beginning of the 15th century, the problems for the survivors, for the Jews, for the Catholics, for the crypto-Jews, for the converted who were forcibly converted, were enormous. It was not just building a broken community and restoring it that was necessary, but how to handle the presence of hundreds or maybe scores of thousands of forced converts in their midst. Iberia entered an unprecedented social situation. Whole communities, including their leaders, their rabbis, had been converted. Most households were divided with at least one family member forcibly converted. All were in mourning for loved ones. The new population of converts was soon known by several names, and these names have caused a lot of confusion. A clear indication, by the way, the fact that there are so many names for them, that their problem and the problem of defining them was so complex. The term, probably the most neutral term, was conversos that was used. That just meant converts. Didn't say what way they converted, nor what was their emotional state after conversion or religious identity after that. Jews called them anusim, the forced ones, those who had been coerced. So there was an initial feeling of great empathy among the Jews, and natural empathy towards this population. They were also known by the Christians as New Christians. Some called them tornedados, turncoats. Others called them marranos, which probably meant pigs. And there was also an interesting, for us today, knowing a little more about Islam in our midst, there was another interesting term that was used in satire for these converts, alburecos, not Burekas, the food, but after Al-Burak, that steed, the mythical, magical steed of Muhammad that took him up to heaven, that was half horse, it was half bird, it was neither fish, it was neither fowl. And this was, in Spanish satire, this is what the conversos were called. The challenge of how to absorb them and what to do with them, how to proceed after this conversion under duress, was a very, very interesting one. The new Christians could not by law revert to Judaism. According to Catholic doctrine, once baptized, they were willy-nilly, regardless of the coercion, they were Christians, since baptism was deemed to be indelible, and reversion to Judaism was tantamount to heresy, punishable by death. But could the converts make peace with their identity? Could they continue to associate with their relatives and former communities? If canon law forced the converts to be Christian, Jewish law and popular custom regarded them otherwise. According to Jewish tradition, that at least from discussions that had come down in medieval times and during the Crusades, the conversos, or at least the first generation of them, were still Jews, not to be reminded of their transgression, despite the fact that they had erred or sinned, still they were Jews. And thus they were to be helped. If, for instance, your father, your sister, your brother, your relative came to you and said they were looking for kosher meat, well, you give them kosher meat. If they ask when a holiday falls out, you tell them when it does. If they want to come to a Seder or have a Brit Milah, this is all part of, once you're not recognizing the authenticity of this conversion under duress, this is part of the communal responsibility within Jewish life. So from the point of view of the old Christians, the new Christian was problematic. From the point of view of the Jews, from the point of view of the church, and even, as we'll see, from the point of view of the rulers. For if an individual could convert, so to speak, and pass, an entire community, neither totally Jewish nor yet Christian, could not, especially not a community as large and talented as the Jews of Spain. Now that they were officially not any longer Jewish, though, all the laws that had restricted them as Jews no longer prevailed. And because they were a literate, talented, urban, energetic, and dynamic population, the new Christians were catapulted very quickly into positions of power and prominence in the court, in the economy, in the municipality, in the church even, and the only place they were more or less barred was in the army. Before long, the animus then that had been directed towards the Jews was directed towards the new Christians. Moreover, since Jews and their converted relatives continued to live side by side until the late 15th century when ghettos were implemented, they were often, in Christian eyes, undifferentiated. Now, one small attempt that becomes significant later, but already starts in the mid-1400s, occurs in the middle of the century. A riot in Toledo broke out against the conversos in 1449. Not against the Jews, against the conversos. And the pogrom began to spread, and as a way of mollifying the rioters, a series of laws of limpieza de sangre, of purity of blood, as they were called, were promulgated. These were racist laws that said if you were of Jewish race, of Jewish blood, of Jewish background, then you would be barred from the army, from the university, from most professions. It was ethnicity, therefore, not religion, that was what mattered in the eyes of the population in Iberia. Jews, as well as the Christians, would soon be dragged into and receptive to a web of Spanish, or I should say Hispanic, notions of race, honor, and lineage that were to become an enduring feature of Sephardic and especially Portuguese Jewry. Finally, the Inquisition was established in 1480, and the Inquisition itself penned the decree of expulsion in 1492, on the eve of the union of Spain with the conquest of the Muslim kingdom of Granada. And the expulsion decree is actually quite honest in terms of what the Inquisition was thinking. It said that Jews must be expelled so that the new Christians, who were bad Christians, would no longer have the example, the influence, the assistance, and an entire list of what these Jews were providing to new Christians, or what new Christians were seeking in Jewish community, that this would no longer happen, and that the new Christians would therefore become good Christians. Now, as many of you know, the expulsion was in fact a horrendous, harrowing, and tragic experience. Jews were given 3 months to wind up their affairs, and leave, or to keep their property and stay and convert. But by the end of July in 1492, there was to be no more Judaism in Spain. Now, about 200,000 Jews left. We don't know how many stayed, but according to the late Professor Chaim Barnard from the Hebrew University, a substantial number tried to leave or left and then couldn't make a go of it. They were adrift in the Mediterranean and returned because the Spanish government said they had several years in which they could retrieve their property if they came back as Christians. It seemed to be a good idea. Many went eastward, although that was kind of scary. You had to get a captain that would take you, that wouldn't leave you adrift. The pirates wouldn't get you. But those who went to the Ottoman Empire or to North Africa ended up with an unbroken Jewish experience. They went from Spain, this harrowing journey, ended up in Turkey or Italy, Turkey, and there was no hiatus in their Jewish identity. They spoke Hebrew, they left with teachers, they spoke Spanish or Catalan, and life, as difficult and as heartbreaking as it was, went on. There were about 100,000, meaning almost half perhaps, of this exile from Spain that took what looked like it was going to be a sensible step. It was closer, the language was similar. If they had sold business or property in Spain, well, they were near the border. They went over the border into Portugal. So all of a sudden, Portugal had, many of them, by the way, were conversos who used the opportunity now as well to go into Portugal and return to Judaism along with the rest of the Jews. What looked, though, like a wise decision was, within 5 years, a disaster. Because the new king of Portugal wanted to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, and one of the stipulations, probably the most cynical wedding stipulation in history, in order for little Isabella to go to Portugal to get the hand of the king, was that Portugal must expel its Jews as well. But the king of Portugal was on the cusp of his great conquests and expeditions in Africa, in the Far East, and though he was willing to get rid of Judaism, he didn't want to get rid of the Jews. And therefore, first he tried by sending off countless children to the uninhabited Portuguese island of São Tomé off the coast of Africa, with the hopes that their parents would then convert and he was all the while getting bribes from the Jews who were desperate about this expulsion, to finally promulgating an expulsion decree where the Jews were required to leave from Lisbon. When they got there, there were no masts in the harbor. There were just priests waiting, and the entire community, the stalwarts who had left Spain, those who had left Spain earlier throughout the 15th century for Portugal, they were all forcibly converted. And there was no option to leave because the gates of Portugal were closed. So you had a different kind of mass conversion, and the Portuguese Jews were given one concession by the king. They would not introduce an Inquisition for 20 years until the Portuguese Jews learned how to be Catholic. And when the 20 years were up, it was possible to bribe. There were very big bribes going on in both the Vatican and in Lisbon to stall the introduction of the Inquisition a little longer. What they didn't realize, what the king didn't realize, was that this period of time among people with this fiber and tenacity was enough to build an infrastructure of secret Judaism. And also remarkable, and we don't know that much about it because of the problematics of sources, was that even 3, 4, 5, and 6 generations after the forced conversions, despite the ferocity with which the Inquisition in Portugal acted, despite the extradition treaties, the Inquisition in Portugal chased Jews who ran to Spain, chased Jews who went to, or secret Jews who went to southern France. Despite all of this, the remnants and the echoes of crypto-Judaism remained. And about 3 years ago, I went to Belmonte on a Shabbat, and it was mind-boggling. The Torah reading was in Portuguese. The community still had many of the psychological manifestations of a kind of harassed and secret Jewry, though their synagogue is a beautiful structure in this little town. And it's just so thought-provoking and haunting. This Portuguese Jewish community and its diaspora, because a diaspora, of course, there was. The ins and outs, leaving Portugal was temporary, and it would be rescinded, the gates would close, the gates would open. So there was, in the 16th century and the 17th century, departure, but generally of individuals and small groups. The diaspora of Portuguese Jews, as well as those who remained, was not homogeneous. So the first thing to say, when you see that some never came back to Judaism, some yearned to be Jewish, Though there were those who wanted to be Catholic and make their peace with it. And there were those who wanted to be both. Those, sometimes both in the course of one lifetime. We know of examples galore from the Inquisition and also from Italy of some very famous poets who were Catholic, Jewish. They took turns depending, I guess, on the mood and the opportunity. And then there were those whom I'll speak about in a moment who wanted to be neither. Even within the same individual, then, the question of identity, Jewish identity of a Portuguese, could fluctuate over the course of a lifetime. As they sought to leave Iberia, though, they faced a new Europe. And as much as it's obvious why the Jews would want to leave, the secret Jews would want to leave, it's not quite as obvious why monarchs who disliked Jews wanted the Portuguese Jews to come in. So here you have the first trait of the Portuguese that stood them in good stead. Departure, migration, mobility, expulsion, and travel had been a phenomenon of Sephardic Jewry since 1391. So that people had, so to speak, a cousin in every port. You could still be a secret Jew in Lisbon with a relative who is now an important merchant trading with the emergent and ascending Ottoman Empire, moving salt through the Balkans, spice from Dubrovnik to Venice, and from Venice to Malaga. And this kind of international trade was extremely important. And it was important also because the Portuguese Jews really had they had a sense of place in which they lived, but as they left, they were above, so to speak, all those imperial, the imperial competition economically. They just did their trade. And their trade was very interesting. Coffee, yes, coffee. It was one of the first things they brought back to Europe. It was one way the mystics of Safed or Tzfat in Palestine could keep up all night doing their special prayers, because the Sephardim among them were bringing coffee into both the ghetto of Venice and often to Tzfat. Tobacco, which was anathema at first and very problematic in Muslim society, well, it was a very interesting kind of contraband that Portuguese Jews were bringing back into Europe. Their knowledge, though, as they began to strain to get out of Portugal, one trait that we have to acknowledge was that their knowledge of Judaism, though dim and distorted, did not cease. This was a myth before, that they were totally isolated. We know that Portuguese Jews, for instance, who served in Morocco as ambassadors to the Muslim kings of Fez, to the Muslims in the city of Sefru, would go to Europe and bring calendars to Portugal. The Ferrara Bible was found among the artifacts that the Inquisition confiscated. That is, the Bible that was written or translated into Spanish in the city of Ferrara, financed by Dona Gracia Mendes, the Portuguese heroine, Portuguese Jewish heroine, and it too came back into Portugal with travelers, with merchants, who went, as the rabbis said with disapproval, to the lands of idolatry. The second distinguishing trait was this persistence of crypto-Judaism over the centuries. Now that had a kind of wrinkle to it. These Jews were forced to lead double lives, overtly as Christian, covertly as Jews, leaving them often with a sense of fragmented identity, a sense of in-betweenness, and because in Portugal they were also graduates of the great, and Spain, of the great universities of 16th century Spain. They had great pride and kind of knowledge and adeptness in secular culture. This made them very interesting new immigrants in many places. Their sense of family, of extended family, was not only a psychological, but an economic reality. And so, as the Portuguese Portuguese Jews begin to seek refuge from the growing might of their Inquisition, some chose to go to Portuguese colonies, even though you weren't supposed to if you were a new Christian or of new Christian background. You weren't supposed to be leaving Iberia. They weren't, as the captains wanted to fill the ships. They wanted to get adventurous and also talented souls to go into the New World. And so a disproportionate number of new Christians begin to venture off to the West. Brazil in particular had its attractions. New Spain as well, Mexico, Colombia, later Colombia. These beckon, and the Inquisition didn't come into the Portuguese possession in South America right away. Before long, Portuguese Jewish trading enclaves could be found in Venice, in Bordeaux, and especially after the 1590 in Livorno. The different princes or rulers, the House of Este, the House of Gonzaga, even the Medicis, the Venetians, who on the one hand incarcerated the Jews in the ghetto, on the other hand in 1589 invited the Portuguese Jews because of their far-flung trade and the myth of their trade abilities to come and to settle. The expansion of Portugal was stopped by the really the emergence of the Dutch in the 16th and the 17th, particularly the 17th century. And the Dutch expansion in the West has really, from the point of view of the Jews, a watershed moment. When the Dutch come into Brazil and temporarily take Brazil for Holland, all those secret Portuguese Jews felt relieved enough because Judaism had been recognized in Holland. They felt safe enough or comfortable enough to come out in the open. And so the first synagogue in the West was a synagogue established in Brazil, in Recife. But this was a short term of possession for the Dutch. And in 1654, in 1650s, there were already Portuguese Jews in the 1630s, 1640s, in the various islands of the Caribbean. When the Dutch were ousted from Brazil in 1654, this migration from Brazil brought the first stragglers of Portuguese Jewry to America and to the founding position in this synagogue. They also went to the most important trade areas in the Caribbean. We forget how important Jamaica and Barbados were to Jewish and Sephardic history in the 17th and 18th century. We know, for instance, when the community of Newport, Rhode Island, was setting up its great synagogue, the Toro Synagogue, later known as Toro Synagogue, they turned to the Portuguese Jews in the Caribbean. The Portuguese Jews in the Caribbean turned to the mother community, which was Amsterdam. And so Amsterdam, then under the leadership of Amsterdam, London, and the Caribbean in the 1650s become the new outposts and the very vibrant homes to the small Portuguese diaspora. I'll close with one or two comments about this diaspora. On the one hand, we have to remember it was small. It's remarkable what 20,000 Jews accomplished. That was the Portuguese diaspora. In Amsterdam, Bordeaux, and Bordeaux was a great trading center, the Gratis family and a handful of Portuguese Jews, Livorno, and the Caribbean islands, and the 5 Portuguese communities in North America. But these pioneers set a pattern, and because they could live, as it were, outwardly undifferentiated lives. That is, there was no way, it's not true, there was no way you could tell that they were Jews. You look in the cemetery at the Toro Synagogue, you'll see the poem that Hawthorne composed of these strange names of Rivera and Lopez. Who were these people with the romance of the old world who had come to the shores of New England? They certainly were a romantic presence, but not a problematic presence. And that was the difference. They didn't ask for specific, particular rights or exemptions that made them different. On the contrary, they wanted to be integrated into the body politic of America. And in fact, when the great Portuguese synagogue, the Synagogue, the Amsterdam Synagogue, was inaugurated in 1675, royalty, Jews, Christians, Protestants, Catholics, all were represented in this Western Portuguese diaspora celebration. There are, as many of you probably are familiar with, there are some beautiful lithographs that celebrate that moment of the inauguration of the Portuguese synagogue. Now, let us just say a few final words then about the culture, the issues of culture of the Portuguese Jews. Because I began by talking about their sense of superiority. And in fact, we know that this sense of lineage, the sense of aristocracy, persisted. When they began to form communities, the Portuguese Jews turned to their Sephardic brethren in the East. They took their rabbis, their first rabbis, from Salonika, from Fez, from Venice. They knew intrinsically that the gap in their own knowledge had to be filled in some fashion. But power in their community resided in the hands of the Mahamad, in the hands of the Parnasim, in the hands of the lay leadership, of traders and merchants, while the rabbis often lamented that they were simply hired personnel. I don't know if things have changed, but the sense of kavod, the sense of the lay power, it was very strong in their communities. The Portuguese put greater emphasis, for instance, on the Bible than other Jewish cultures. In fact, this is one of the things that made them such an interesting neighbor in Protestant England or in Protestant Calvinist Amsterdam. This ability to converse about the Bible, which they had read in Latin, with their new theologically oriented Protestant neighbors. In the literature and behavior of their non-rabbinic leaders, Jewish pride was closely associated among the Portuguese with Iberian notions of masculinity and nobility. This is not to say that they didn't produce their own leaders, because yes, they did. But the widespread belief of the ideal of the merchant and communal leader, who was also a Talmudic scholar, never took root in this Jewish community. Given their complex past, it's astonishing how many chose to remain Jewish in some fashion, and how most of them integrated smoothly into a Jewish community, a Jewish way of life that they had never known. The first community, Jewish community, that most Portuguese Jews met in the diaspora was the community that they created themselves. So they created it according to their own rules. The great Spanish Jewish leader of the Exodus of 1492, Don Isaac Abravanel, recognized the supreme irony of Sephardic history. Despite the mass conversion, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews would never be assimilated, Abravanel declared. In his commentary, and I'll close with this, to the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 20, verse 33, Abravanel predicted, "The indigenous people of the land will always call them Jews, and they shall be designated Israel, perhaps sometimes against their will. They will be accused of Judaizing secretly, and they may be burned at the stake." But Portuguese Jews were the pioneers because of their very distinctive urbane, twofold culture, wandering and mobile sense of family across the globe, in setting up and establishing the great communities of Western Jewry. Thank you.
Dear sirs, it's for me a great pleasure to be here in this place. The present is a part of the past, and culture and history are always this complexity. We don't have the past only in the museums. We have the past in our lives, in the present. In first, the heritage is a kind of a mythic past. Since when are Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, and from where they come from? In second, we need to look to another problem, one of the main questions. Which was the place of Jewish communities in the beginning of the Portuguese kingdom? In third, we need to give place for a relevant field. Also, in the Middle Ages, we need to look to the power, to the richness, the culture, and the scientific knowledge of Portuguese Jewish communities. In fourth, we have a complex issue, the new Christians. Are they Jews? Are they Catholics? Are they a specific identity built in part by the Inquisition? And finally, coming to the present, where is this heritage? And firstly, what are we talking about when we say Jewish heritage? Well, we don't know exactly when Jews come to the Iberian Peninsula. But we have an important source. When the Romans have dominated the peninsula, they could take two possible names. One from the Greeks, Iberia, they refused it. The other from a Semitic word, Hispania, used even by Jews and by Phoenicians. The meaning of this last expression is not yet understood, but may be something like land of the metals. This option shows the place of the communities of Jews of Jews and the Phoenicians in the 2nd century before Common Era. Did Jews come with Phoenicians? The oldest archaeological traces we have in Portugal, in the center of the country, is a ring stone from the Roman city of Amaya from the 2nd century. In the south, we have several other traces, a tombstone with a menorah in the city of Mertola, and a Hebrew inscription at Silves from the 4th century. In the Middle Ages, we know that the first Portuguese king, Dom Afonso Henriques, had many Jews with him. They were the only ones who could read. They were the only ones who knew something about finance. Several times we have noticed of Jews as tax collectors. In the royal legislation, the expression used is "my Jews." They depend directly to the monarch. Till the 15th century, the communities will be organized according to proper laws with their own institutions, with their own Jews. Also, in the Middle Ages, Jewish communities have consolidated their identity. The Portuguese Jews have paid the maritime discoveries, but they are also the culture and the science of Portugal. We have rich schools of illumination. The first printing books are works in Hebrew, and we have figures of science and culture. For example, in medicine, from the city of Castelo Branco, we have Amato Lusitano, one of the most important Renaissance physicians. And now the most complex problem, the new Christians. At the end of the 15th century, everything has changed. In 1496, after receiving the Jews escaped from Spain, the new Portuguese king decreed that all Jews will be baptized. They were forced to become Christians, the new Christians. Many of them have embraced this new religion, but many others no. They have continued the Jewish practice at home. Possibly for some generations, some rituals were keeping up, but for those who wanted to keep their faith, escape was the only possibility. In fact, in 1536 was established the Inquisition. For almost three centuries, the persecution will be very hard. Some communities reached to our days with apparent Jewish practice. However, it is difficult to know what is true heritage and what is an identity construction caused by the Inquisition itself. Forced conversions, forced confessions under torture were common. It is impossible to be objective in this subject. Coming to the present, the heritage in a more common sense are the buildings, but also the people, the traditions, and the identity. In Portugal, there are now a great rediscovery of the Jewish roots in our identity. We have realized the importance of a part of us, the Jews, in our history. There is also a revival of many people to Judaism, rediscovering or creating genealogies. Every year every year we found new traces of Jewish presence. In the center of Portugal, many cities are working hard in this rediscovery. Belmonte is the most significant city with a Jewish community possibly coming from the Middle Ages, the only one who survived to the Inquisition. This city has a Jewish museum and a new synagogue built 10 years ago. In Portugal today, more than a rediscovery of buildings, of patrimony, we are working in a process of identity. In the last month, the Legislative Assembly passed a law that gives automatic citizenship to those who prove to be descendant of the Jews fled to Portugal due to religious persecution. In the last week, at Cabanas de Viriato, near Viseu, Aristides Sousa Mendes was honored in his hometown. He was consul in Bordeaux and has saved about 30,000 Jews with his visas. This memory of the Second War is also part of a heritage that the Center of Portugal is rediscovering. Thank you for your attention, please.
I've had the experience over the past couple of years being a rabbi at the Spanish synagogue of being contacted by individuals that trace their ancestry to conversos. I'd be curious for you to comment. You both touched on a little bit of this question of to what extent was there actual secret Judaism taking place in Portugal, or perhaps was there not so much taking place and the Inquisition was just bringing trumped up charges for perhaps purposes of extorting and trying to take the possessions of these new Christians?
The phenomenon of the return of descendants of crypto-Jews to their Jewish identity or to curiosity about their Jewish identity is extraordinary. The geneticists have, in fact, studied DNA in the Iberian Peninsula and have found extraordinary data on the relationships to Jews among not just towns up near the border, but all over Portugal and all over Spain. Students will come up to me, Hispanic students from South America, with stories that definitely show shards or remnants of Judaism that have been passed on. There is also a literature, a fairly lively and not so friendly controversy. I'm not part of it, but I watch these people go at each other about the how you use the Inquisition records. Presently, scholars who are Jewish scholars who are engaged in using these very, very voluminous sources are convinced that although obviously people tried, number one, to anticipate what would be the charges so that they could confess beforehand to the most mild of the possible transgressions, still, it seems quite clear, not only in the specifics of the charges, but of the testimonies, that a strain of crypto-Judaism continued for centuries. One remarkable piece of evidence we have of it is if you go up, for instance, to Newport, Rhode Island, and see the home of Aaron Lopez and some of the stories about Lopez. Lopez came in the 18th century right out of Portugal, taking his extended family with him, and jumping right into the Jewish community, one of the founders and leaders of that community. How did he keep his identity for 200, 300 years? Well, we know that there were specific ways that the women, for instance, passed on the traditions. If you're lighting a candle in the black bottle because you don't want the Shabbat candles to be seen in your village, eventually, and you quickly and furtively mumble a bracha, eventually it's the candle in the black bottle that becomes the way you're Jewish, and you forget the bracha.
Just one example. For 2 months ago, someone sent me an email telling me that my name is something Mendes, like me. I'm from the center of Portugal. All my family are from the center of Portugal. I knew that my mother, my grandmother do something. Does I am Jew? The question is not, how can I become a Jew? No, it's, does I am Jew? And then some other words. And who is this? This person is a Catholic priest. And then I talked to him, and he wants to be Jew and Catholic priest at the same time.
Dr. Gerber, you spoke about this Portuguese diaspora that grows out of this converso returning community. If you could, to what extent do you think the experience of being conversos played a role in their establishing these communities in the New World that were so different than the communities that had been in the old Jewish world?
The New World had a different element in it, certainly if you're talking about the Caribbean and South America, and that was the element of slavery. They were enslaved societies, and that created different kinds of questions that arose in places like Suriname, where Jewish men were marrying their domestic slaves or having relations with them, from which offspring, mulatto offspring, came. So those kinds of questions were new, but organization of community was surprisingly traditional. The beautiful synagogue in Barbados that's been restored in the last several years has next to it, they discovered recently, a mikveh.
What is the atmosphere in Portugal today towards the Inquisition, the treatment of Jews historically? Of course, today, as you know, we've heard about the openness and welcoming nature towards the Jewish community, and the steps in the Holocaust, and really so many wonderful things. But as far as education about the history, I was curious if you could maybe tell us a little bit about what that is like today in Portugal.
After the end of the Inquisition in the early 19th century, the Portuguese scholars don't talk anymore about Jews, about Inquisition, nothing. We don't have great mentions in the monumental histories of Portugal. No, we don't have in our education system anything. Now, for the last years, yes, there are many people, there are many students working that area, the Inquisition, the Jewish culture, but it's very new. It's for 20 years. It's a new phenomenon.